Yeah, there's, a lot of discussion about UAP activity around sensitive military sites, nuclear installations, national borders, territorial waters as possibly being some form of surveillance. And so it introduces to my mind the question, should we be doing some form of counter surveillance on them? And this is where, I wonder what would be the CI approach to assessing the activity and intent of a non-human actor, demonstrating what they can technologically in terms of craft, potential craft movements, human interaction, and even human psychic or telepathic engagement, as some surmise is taking place. What would be the CI approach?
So, for example, when we look at an issue that is as controversial and harrowing as an abduction issue, where we have data that points to the presence of an anomaly, which we'll call a craft, and the presence of a biological entity or an animated entity or biologics of sorts, what we can do is see where those two profiles come together, see what questions need to be answered, and then go for further data collection, information collection. And then from there, we start looking for those venues to where we may have the opportunity to take a proactive approach to protecting not only ourselves, but also looking at putting some space between the NHI and humanity itself, right? So essentially what we know is that we have anomalies in the forms of craft that have an affiliation or a relationship with animated entities that are putting itself in a position to approach humanity.
It's interesting. This needs to be a field without gates and without gatekeepers, because we're not filtering this up to one authority that's going to enact all this change. I would hope that they would take it as information and possibly enact good change, but I think society has its own change to enact, its own direct intervention to make in the processes and activities of this potential UAP NHI presence. We can change the operating conditions for them as citizens. For example, through a sensing platform in the home of an experiencer who's reporting abduction. Once that's in the home, plugged into the power, does the behavior of the phenomenon change? Does it adapt? That's fascinating information. And it also might effectively change the experience of the person being affected. So we have direct agency, the ability to affect direct change. And so therefore, what we might call a citizen intelligence project could take shape. And I'd love your thoughts on this. Like, how can civilians who are not experts in any of this take some of the principles of intelligence and CI and these different collection approaches, this fusion process, and begin to either contribute to a collective fusion process or maybe even undertake their own personal intelligence project?
I'm going to segue to a project that the Society for UAP Studies is working, and it's a workshop that's going to explore forensic investigative methodologies within citizen science and governmental entities. Right. So this is a project that is currently in its formation in the Society for UAP Studies to start having these types of discussions. And so, if someone goes, well, Josh, I don't have the time to go get, a doctorate in strategic security to figure this out. I don't work for the USIC. Like, how am I going to apply a probability statement to what it is I'm looking at, especially when we're taught that you render findings and conclusions. And essentially we are trying to change the way that we approach data and that we approach the scientific method, right? So, first,
what does that change? Just so we're clear on what does that change as you see it?
So the change is that instead of looking at it as a method, we're approaching it as a scientific process, right? And in a scientific process, you may not have a lot to begin with. You may not have a lot to start with. We can take the intention study from the SCU coupled with the origin study the SCU is doing, and then take this third piece of understanding narratives surrounding abductions and experience, like what message is delivered to people, and then overlay it on a timeline and see if we can see a spike, an increase or a decrease in UAP reporting at the time.
Right.
And then now we can determine our hot spots. We can determine which messages are associated with which messages are associated with which reported shape, and we can start comparing it to UAP signatures. And so now For example, let's say we have a UAP report that occurs in Washington State, and then at the same time that a UAP is reported, somebody receives a message in Brazil. Well, that's a pretty significant correlation. And again, correlation does not equate to causation. That is a significant correlation, especially if it happens repeatedly. Now that gives us a means of maybe understanding through the scientific process of what's occurring.
Sure. Or if there's a mass appearance in the future of a UAP craft over a major population center, and individuals report, they would have to have a way of reporting it, receiving telepathic, psychic, internally received messages. And we would need to know what that message is. What's the call to action? What's the power dynamic? Logic, reason, evidence collection, observation. These are things that unite us into a platform for action. Whereas intuition, without that, I don't think will. So just a note on that. I want to just kind of put this out that a lot of folks look at the activity of UAP and a potential NHI and say, okay, if there's a message, maybe they just want us to think this about them, or to think favorably about them, or to be open, right? And that's possible, right? That's called influencing perception. Is NHI trying to just influence us to see them a certain way? Well, we all do that. Companies do that. Governments do that. Husbands and wives do that, right? So nothing inherently nefarious to that. Or is there a strategic operation to shape perception in a way that is deceptive or manipulative, or that steers society broadly, or selected individuals individually in ways that are tactical and not in the best interests of the recipient?
There's research into these abduction cases where these harrowing experiences are retold in explicit detail, and I would say probably intrinsic detail as to what happened during the encounter, and it's very dangerous, and it's very scary, and then we have these ones to where whatever it is just doesn't seem to care whether we're present or not, right? And almost takes it's almost orthogonal, I think, is what the term that Michael Glosson once brought up when he and I were talking about it, that it just seems to cut through whatever it is that is here, like us, and just establishes itself. And, so how do we start looking at intent for that? Well, we would have to categorize characteristics of, positive interactions, negative interactions, and neutral interactions, right? And even though we might not be able to start tying it to specific, I'm going to use the term platforms here, NHI platforms or NHI entity, right? We can at least state NHI, not the NHI, because that indicates one, but NHI, we can assess with X confidence, NHI, intends to do X, Y, and Z. We're now looking at the myriad of hypotheses that are out there, and you mentioned a few of them. Are they observing? Are they doing a human experiment? Are they, and then when we look at something like that, right, that's where we could use something like analysis of competing hypotheses to start defining intent. The SCU intention study, they noticed a behavior shift in UAP activity where in the beginning it was pretty overt and
a lot of daytime appearances, more military fixation.
And then over time, it turned into more of a clandestine approach or a clandestine feel.
I think it was that there was more like nighttime approaches, a more civilian interaction, then the reports of the reported experiences of abduction began, in the 60s, Betty Barney Hill, and then took off from there. And then the cultural started to enter the culture. So there seemed to be some kind of shift in activity, which again, it's like, not saying that's NHI necessarily. I'm sure there's some human activity all in there, but any shift in the trend is potential signal to me of intent. And you look at the situational, like what was that coinciding with in the 60s and 70s? Like what geopolitical events, what technological events, and that's even environmental events. That could be indicative of an interest and therefore an intent to intervene either out of self-interest, out of our interest claimed, or out of another interest.
We have reflections from experiencers, one stating, nah, they're here to help. The other one stating, I don't know, like we have this genetic seeding program. And then through information gathering, we come to learn that it's one NHI. And so now we have a competition of facts. We can evaluate the source. And that's really how you figure out when something is an influence effort. I want to say disinformation, an influence effort. You got to evaluate the source. Who is the source? What are the source's intentions? How long has the source interacted? Why is the source interacting beyond the scope of intentions? What is its motivation, right? And that's when you start going through those list of questions and you're scrutinizing the source that is providing the message.